Good morning, everyone. We're just going to allow a couple seconds for everyone who's been in the waiting room to make their way into the webinar, and then we'll get started this morning. Morning, everybody. I think we're still expecting a few more participants, and I see the numbers are climbing there still. So we'll wait a few more seconds before we get started. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. My name's John Sturr-Bischoff. I'm the Director of Climate Change Compliance. Just a couple of logistics here before we begin. We're using the Zoom tool this morning. We're going to be recording the session. Everybody's mic is muted except for the presenters. And if you have questions throughout the course of the day, there's a Q&A button where you can type in your question, and we'll respond to it there. Looks like we're pretty stable for numbers. Dragon, do you want to advance to the next slide, and I'll do a little bit of introduction? Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us. This is a session that that I guess we've scheduled now that the first compliance period of tier has been reported on. So people have I guess gone through the process once for the 2020 year by and large. We had committed to circle back with the sector and discuss our approach to benchmarking for aggregate facilities for the 2021 year and beyond. And so that's our main focus for today. We'll talk about our preferred option in terms of benchmarking period for aggregates. We're also going to talk a little bit about some feedback that we'd received on how to treat drilling and completion emissions within the aggregate system. And we'll have some opportunity to discuss those two the topics with the group and get your questions, and also we'll outline some ability for you to write in some of your feedback if we don't get to it today, and then we'll talk about next steps, and we'll have some closing remarks. So with me today from my team is Paul, and then from our policy shop we have Dragon and Ned, and Dragon's going to lead us through a lot of the slides today. As I mentioned, the recording, or we will be recording the session, but all the participants' mics will be muted for the day. And we've already posted to the website a discussion document which covers the contents essentially of the slide deck. So I think we don't have an intention to post the slide deck since we have a discussion document posted which covers that. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm told that Peter Moore is also on the webinar today. So that's great. So we've got probably less than an hour and a half's worth of materials for you. So I anticipate we may be done a little bit early, but it depends a little bit on the questions that come up and the commentary that we get from people to go through. So again, Dragan will be presenting the topics for today, and he'll lead us through the slides. And in case you joined late, if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A tool within Zoom to post your questions, and we'll be working through those through the course of the morning. Okay, Dragan, did you want to go ahead and start us off on the benchmark years?
Yes, thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. It's Dragan Pejic from the policy team. So the first topic we would like to discuss is the reference years for the benchmarking. And to remind everyone, initially through our standard benchmarking standard, we specified that benchmarks would be based on the 3 consecutive years of operations. And the first benchmark here being the calendar year prior to the aggregate facility's first year of designation as an aggregate facility. Due to unprecedented time that we lived through, we basically modified that approach and gave operators option to choose either 2019 or 2020 as a benchmark year, depending on what would be the best representing their operation. Again, in light of these recent pandemic events. As John mentioned, we have advised the sector that we will come back to the approach for 2021 and onwards in regards to what reference years should be considered. For the reference years to be taken in consideration, there are a few things that we looked into. Of course, number one is how many reference years should be included in the facility specific benchmark. Then, of course, what would be the first reference year for that. And then we also looked into should that period be period of consecutive years or not. Again, to give some flexibility to the operators in case that's required and needed. When we analyzed the impact of the first reference year to be considered for the facility-specific benchmark, we can realize that the sooner that first reference year is chosen and considered in the benchmark, the sooner the companies can monetize on their capital investment projects that they have invested in emission intensity reduction for the aggregates. Similarly, in respect to the final reference year to be considered for the benchmark, we find it's beneficial for companies and operators to the sooner the reference year, a final reference year is from the timing of entering the aggregate program, the companies can more timely plan and invest accordingly into their projects for reduction of emissions at the facilities. We also believe that significantly extending the reference period year past the year of acceptance into the program may cause the price signal to be lost, and this wait and see period may not be as beneficial as someone may think. We also are committed to provide flexibility to address uniqueness of individual operation circumstances as much as that's possible and feasible. So in that respect, the option that Alberta Environment and Park see as a preferred option and approach for reference years is basically to select 2 or 3 years within a 3 consecutive years period, starting with the year prior to being accepted into the tier aggregate program. What would that mean? Basically, here is an example. So let's say for a facility that has been accepted in the program for 2020 year, that aggregate facility would basically be able to select it would give facilities flexibility to select different years based on that. For example, there are 4 different options here. The facility can select all 3 years, 2019, 2020, 2021, or any other combination with dropping one of the years in between. And basically for 2021 compliance year, let's say, if someone would like to have all 3 years included, that would be limited to 2019 and 2020. And let's say a company would not like to see 2020 in their reference years and would like to proceed only with 2019 and 2021 for benchmarking. For 21 compliance period, 2019 will be only considered, and for all years after 2022 and onward, these 2 years, 2019 and 2020-21, will be part of the benchmark. So at this point, I guess let's just do a quick test and see if this approach, I mean, is any, I mean, we're gonna go into discussion later on, but let's just see if there is any question regarding how to understand this approach. So I don't see any questions at the moment. So maybe should we move to the second topic, John, drilling completion?
Yeah, let's move to the second topic, and we've got time set aside for questions overall. So that sounds good.
Okay. So let's talk about the treatment of drilling completion activities within the aggregate. So the reason why we are discussing this, actually, just to remind what current status is that basically emissions coming out of drilling completion activities during reference years are included in the facility-specific benchmark calculations. Another point to note is that these emissions from drilling completion, they are treated as any other emission within the aggregate. So we don't differentiate. In respect to drilling completion. So what's the downside and potential downside with this approach? Potentially, we can see inflated benchmark if, let's say, drilling completion are really significant, I mean, emissions from them. So that benchmark may not be the most representative benchmark for those reference years. Another aspect to that could be that, let's say, if a benchmark has been set for the reference years during which there was no drilling and completion activities, then later on company would like to conduct some, they may see that as a lack of incentive to conduct significant activities, drilling and completion activities. There are few, so how to approach that? Well, one thing would be, for example, to develop a sector-wide drilling completion benchmark, and then basically benchmark the activities and compliance accordingly to that. The big challenge with this approach would be finding the benchmark that would be representative of the whole sector due to the number of well configuration that is basically in the sector. Another approach would be, for example, to go with a facility-specific benchmark. And in this case, the big challenge would be the resourcing involved with this, that is basically needed to develop them, verify, and administer would be challenging. What we also heard from some of the stakeholders is that for some of them, the fraction of drilling completion emissions may not be that significant compared to the overall emissions at the aggregate facility. I mean, percent-wise, they may not be too pronounced. Having that in mind, what Alberta Environment and Park is see as a preferred option for treatment of drilling completion is basically no change to the current treatment for drilling completion, meaning we will include these emissions in both benchmarking and compliance reporting, as is the case right now. So now is a good time to hear some questions and comments in respect to both reference years and drilling completion approach that we just outlined.
So we've got a few questions here, Dragon, which I think if you wanted to answer them, that would be fine. I can read out this first one if you wish, and maybe it makes sense to go back to the summary slide there, yeah, that you've got. So the first question is, when would a company have to select what reference year it is choosing?
So that would be basically a September 1 deadline, if I'm not mistaken, during the compliance reporting.
Yeah, so that's right. So we've got in the regulation, we have set out a September 1st date for making a benchmark application that would apply for that compliance year. I guess we recognize in the option that we're putting forward that if people wanted to use 2019 and hadn't previously, you know, if there are challenges there in terms of getting that verified 2019 data to us by September 1st, we have some flexibility in that for this year. But I think we certainly would like to know people's elected approach for this year by September 1st, in terms of which period they'd like to use.
So for the 2022, we see the question, how will this option work for a new facility that will start in 2022? So so again, your first reference year is the year before entering the regulation, which would be 2021. We also now, since in this case, so apparently this would be the case when the aggregate facilities enter the regulation in 2022. So I think this stakeholder maybe is referring to the case that not all of the operational data would be available for the aggregate in 2021 if case they are new operator. I'm not quite clear to this. John, would I like to, what's your understanding of the question?
Yeah. So I think let's unpack that in two parts. So like just generally speaking, the option that we're laying out gives you the choice to use I guess 2 or 3 years, which can include the year prior to when you're entering the regulation. So if you're entering the regulation for 2022, it would give you the option to use 2021, 2022, and 2023, or 2 years within that period. And so if you didn't, if you weren't operating at all in 2021, then really the pathway for you in this proposal would be to use the 2022 and the 2023 years of data in order to establish your benchmark. So for that 2022 year, you would be necessarily, I guess, on a same year benchmark if you hadn't been operating previously. Okay, and then I think we've got a follow-up point related to a question that we typed an answer to. So this was about that historic or prior to being in tier data. So just to clarify, I guess like folks that elected to use 2019 for 2020 for the 2020 year as a benchmark reference, you would have to provide verified data for that year. So if for some reason, I guess the data was unavailable or not of suitable quality, that might also a little bit limit your options in terms of being able to pick up that year prior to entering tier for benchmarking purposes. So again, I guess maybe the advantage of not using that prior year is that you don't have to administratively collect and verify the data for the year prior to entering into the tier regulation. Okay, so a question here from Peter Bryson. For a company in 2020 that used the 2020 as a benchmark and wanted to go back to the 1920, would 2019 now need to be verified? So yes, that's right. So if people wanted to build 2019 into their benchmark for their 2021 reporting, we would need to receive verified 2019 data to support that expansion of their benchmark period. Does selection of 2 or 3 years within a 3 consecutive year period apply to 2020 compliance year and onward? So it wouldn't apply for 2020. For the 2020 year, we gave the option of using 2019 or 2020, but it would apply for the 2021 year. And again, the idea is that we're moving into a fixed benchmark. So for a facility that was in the program for the 2020 year, the idea is that by the time we were reporting on 2022, the benchmark would be fully fixed and static from that point onwards. Kind of a repeat, maybe a previous question. If you've not submitted a 2019, okay, that's 2019 benchmark submission. Is it too late to do so if we wish? So again, you can submit verified 2019 data in order to extend the period of your benchmark for your 2021 reporting year. Okay, and then Rebecca Cripps has a question. To confirm, we need to reapply by September 1st each year for aggregate facilities. So that's not the case. There is an option for facilities under tier to apply to have an updated facility-specific benchmark. And the deadline for that application would be September 1st of the year for which it's to apply. But the intention generally, again, is to fix the benchmark by 2022 for those facilities that have been in the program for 2020, or by 2021 if people elect to use the 19 and 20 year, and then have the benchmark static from there forward, with consideration, I guess, if there's significant transfer of facilities in or out of your aggregate. Okay, question here from Barry. What is the advantage of having lower benchmark emissions years? So the again, the period, the benchmark period, defines the performance against which your reduction target is assigned to, and then what you have to meet in your subsequent compliance reporting. So the emissions intensity performance of your historic period is essentially the reference by which you're going to be having to meet your reduction targets in each of your compliance years. So the performance in that benchmark period will, I guess, be, if you will, a bit of a reference point or an anchor against which your future performance will be compared when you're doing your annual compliance reporting. Another question here from Greg. Why are companies benchmark against themselves versus an industry benchmark? This does not address the changing production energy intensity profile of normal declining conventional production. So we do have, I guess, a structure or a mechanism within tier to construct a high performance benchmark. I guess what we've seen from the review of the data that we saw in applications for benchmarks for 2019, and I guess also in the 2020 performance data that we saw, was that the ability to set a high performance benchmark for the sector is likely very challenging. And if we did set a high performance benchmark, it's probably only going to be applicable to a very small number of operators, because what we did see is that there's a very wide range of emissions intensity performance across the aggregates that we've observed. So while we do have a mechanism in the regulation, it doesn't look like the data is probably sufficiently comparable to create a meaningful high performance benchmark for the conventional oil and gas sector. That wasn't particularly the scope of the discussion today, but I guess that's what we've observed so far in terms of the benchmark applications and the 2020 year performance data that we've seen. Okay, and again, a good question here from Carrie. I think we've answered some of this already, but just to important recap. I guess we are looking for an indication by September 1st if you're intending to add 2019 to your benchmarking period, but we understand that the timing for doing that is likely to be a challenge, and I think we're certainly open to those applications coming into us later in the fall, but we'd probably be aiming to have those into us before the end of calendar year. Dragon will go over when we talk about next steps about approximately when we're looking to finalize our decision on the approach for the benchmarking years. Okay, question from Peter here. If we do an acquisition or sale in 2021-22, can aggregate benchmarks be pulled together or pulled out depending on the nature of the sale? So we are certainly intending to use existing data where we can. If we have to update benchmarks for acquisitions or sales, our ability to do that will probably depend a little bit on the significance of the non-Petronex reported fuels to the aggregates, but we certainly are looking to be able to make updates to benchmarks using historic facility level data where possible in the case of aggregations, further aggregations due to sales or significant removals of facilities from existing aggregates. Okay, so Dominic's got a question. Will the proposed option of choosing benchmark years include assessment correlation of annual emissions with production, as was the case with compliance benchmark units? So yeah, that'll still be something that we're looking at in terms of the benchmark units. I think in most cases, hopefully we've gotten to a good landing place for our 2022 compliance. Certainly, we've indicated in a few of our benchmark assignment letters that we'll be continuing to monitor a few of the benchmark units where we weren't able to find good correlations. But I think for the most part, we've now put aggregates kind of on the benchmark unit, which seems to work best for their facility. And so hopefully that'll continue to be the case as people add some additional data to their benchmarking period. So Hillary's got a question for facilities entering tier after 2020. Your first reference year will start the year before you enter, but you're allowed to exclude 1 year from the 3-year period. So like generally to the degree possible, in order to keep the clear signal for improvements, we would aim to use the year prior for reference period. If there's reasons that isn't feasible, for example, if the sites weren't existing or the year was an anomaly, again, we've got the flexibility in the proposed approach to exclude that. I mean, as I was saying before, if that prior year is excluded, then your first year within the program would have to be a little bit like 2020 for most people in terms of being a same year reference. Hopefully that's clear, Hillary, but if not, I'm happy to follow up afterwards. A question from Colton. In the event of aggregate emissions dropping significantly year over year over a 3-year span, for example, past 2022, would a benchmark redesignation be required? So again, the intention of the program is to have people invest in emissions intensity improvements, and so we wouldn't re-benchmark on the basis of people undertaking those improvements. As I said, one thing certainly that we will be looking at is if there's significant additions or divestitures from an aggregate, we may need to re-benchmark in those cases in order to get back to a representative starting point. And also, I guess, as I mentioned, the facilities can request us to look at or relook at the benchmark for their aggregate through an application by September 1st of the compliance period that we would be examining. Okay. A bit of a longer question here. I'll read it out, I guess. If a facility joined TIER for 2020 but didn't submit a facility-specific benchmark application for 2019 and only submitted a report for 2020 last month, once the AP gave the option, can they still submit a verified facility-specific benchmark application for 2019 by September 2021 and use 2019 as their first it says first compliance year? I think we'll interpret that to mean the first benchmark year. In that case, would their true-up obligation be adjusted based on their 2019 intensity rather than just 10% of their 2020 stationary fuel combustion emissions? So we're not suggesting any changes to the 2020 reporting, but certainly facilities under this proposed option can submit data, verified data for 2019 and have that 2019 period become part of their benchmark for their aggregate. Maybe a related question from Andrew. Does what we elect to do for the 2021 compliance year affect what we use for 2020? i.e., are there any scenarios where we would have to change our 2020 compliance reporting? And so no, the intention is there wouldn't be any scenarios where people would have to change their 2020 compliance reporting. Yeah, I think a question here from John, is there flexibility on the September deadline? This does not leave much time to complete and verify benchmark intensity. Yes, absolutely. There'll be flexibility around that September deadline, but we would like to get an indication from people for that September deadline if they are intending to, I guess, submit a 2019 data set to expand their benchmark application. And Dragon will go through a little bit the next steps in terms of finalizing the approach that we're talking about here today. So a question here from Peter Bryson. If I am a new aggregator in 2021, do I use 2021 or do I go back and use 2020? I think the proposed approach that we've got before folks allows for either. So I think either option is possible under the proposal. So question here from Eileen. Regarding the acquisitions and divestitures within our aggregate, if a significant change may be occurring but is not finalized until after September 1st, is there an opportunity to revise the benchmark application? So that's an interesting question. the way that we've set up the aggregates, you would have, I guess, it depends a little bit on whether this divestiture or additional facilities were already in the tier program. Because if those sites that you're adding were already in the tier program, they would stay in the reporting for the aggregate where they belong for the year. The only instance where you'd have a significant change in your aggregate after September 1st of a year would be if you're bringing in a significant quantity of conventional oil and gas facilities that had never been in tier. Otherwise, those changes in the population would get reflected into the next year's aggregate composition. And then you would have, I guess, until September 1st of that year to request changes if required. Another question from Dan. For 2020 year, my company used 2019 baseline, but recently we purchased some facilities, which would be aggregate facilities as well. Should we redo the baseline? If yes, September 1st deadline for 2021 baseline seems too tight. So again, a couple of elements here. So if those sites were acquired and they should maybe, if they haven't been and they weren't in tier, they should probably get added to your aggregate for 2021. So you can do an application for that. It depends a little bit, I guess, in terms of rebaselining for the aggregate, how significant those facilities were to the population that you already had. But in some cases, if we don't have the historic 2019 data for those aggregates, then yes, we may need some additional data for 2019. And the deadline, as I mentioned, for September 1st is flexible in terms of getting that data to us. So we have until later into the fall to receive that data from you if needed. If you, another question here from Candace, if you amalgamated with another company in 2019, does that change how things can be submitted? So again, for a year, we set out what the composition of the aggregate is based on what you've applied for with the department. So, so I guess the answer to your question is that the submissions, I guess, should reflect the composition of the aggregate for the period that you're submitting against. Hopefully that answers the question. So a question here from Esther. For acquisitions that require a recalculation of the benchmark, are companies expected to use historical data for the new larger aggregate? Would you need to go back and use the 19 and 20 benchmark, or would the new benchmark be the first year of acquisition? So where we can, we would like to go back and use the historic data, because if we, I guess, re-benchmark folks every time that there's a significant acquisition, then we erode the price signal in the system, because we're basically sliding those benchmarks forward in time with the acquisition events. So we're looking where we can to use the historic period to set the benchmarks for the facilities. In some cases, that might require additional data if you've undergone an acquisition and the company that you've acquired from didn't submit a 2019 benchmark to us for those facilities. Okay, question here from Nazar. Thanks you. A few questions. Would an option to select a new benchmark unit be allowed when applying for one of the 4 options? And so I would say generally we're open to discuss the benchmark unit with folks if people think that there's a better option in place. So that's, I guess, the first question. And then any information on development of aggregate HPBs. I maybe mentioned a little bit earlier, Nazar, that the data that we've seen so far makes it seem quite challenging to develop a meaningful high performance benchmark for the sector. We've seen a pretty broad performance range in the benchmark setting that we've done for folks that submitted 2019 data, and also, I guess, in the data that we've looked at for 2020. So I guess in terms of the update, I would say that it's going to be quite challenging to set a meaningful high performance benchmark in the conventional oil and gas sector, or I guess multiple high performance benchmarks by product type. Okay, and I think we've addressed this one, but again, a question about providing the 2019 verified data. So I think we would certainly like to see if people would like to add 2019 to their benchmark set. We would like to see that to us before the end of calendar year. Okay. And just again to confirm, we've got another question about impact on 2020. So nothing that we're discussing today would impact your 2020 reports or the true-up obligation that's been determined for 2020. Okay, we'll take a few more of these, I think. So if we use 2020 as our benchmark for 2021 and then for 2022, do we need to use both 2020 and 2021 as our benchmark? So again, the concept here is that you are in this situation having the option to use either 2 or 3 years in this period from 2019 to 2021. So so in this scenario, if you use 2020 as your benchmark, then yes, you would kind of in a sense be on that 2-year option with 2020 and 2021 as your reference years for the 2022 reporting and beyond. Dragon, maybe you've given this question a more thought than I have. So Nazar's asked, if no application is received by September 1st, is there a default option which will be applied?
Yes, that's a good question. And in that case, what we would be considering is the option number 1 that you see here on the screen, basically 3 years, 3 reference years, with the first reference year being the year prior to entering the tier program. That will be kind of default.
Yeah, so I think in that situation, we would assume that somebody's going to carry on with whatever they've done, and that like Dragon's saying, if they've used 2019, we'll assume that they're going to do a 3-year benchmark. If they had used 2020, we'll assume that they're going to carry on and use 2020 and 2021. So I think we'll build off of what people have submitted to us and default to the 3-year benchmark where people have included 2019. Okay, so this is maybe a related question. Is a benchmark application required for facilities which use 2020 as a benchmark for 2020 compliance year, and the plan is to use 2020 for 2021 compliance report again? So that's right. So if people have elected, so that's good. So maybe we should unpack the default scenarios here in a bit more detail. So if somebody has used the same year benchmark for 2020 and don't let us know that they're going to do otherwise, We'll be using that 2020 data to form the benchmark for 2021. And then for 2022, we'll be using the 2020 and 2021 data. So that means if folks don't let us know of any change and you've used 2020 same year benchmark for 2020 reporting, then we'll also be using the 2020 data to form a benchmark for 2021. We'll roll that in to a 2-year benchmark using 2020 and 2021 data for 2022 and subsequent years. So hopefully that's clear. Question here from Anatai. Follow-up question for 2019 verification. If they wanted to go back to 2019 as a benchmark, what is the deadline for the 2019 verification? Is it September 1st? So no, we'll be open to receive that later into the fall. I'm going to say no later than the end of calendar year. Another question here from Ellie. All aggregates approved in 2020 must submit their 2 or 3 year FSB choice by September 1st, correct? Yes, that's what we'd be looking for people to make an election. We've talked a little bit about how we'll default if we don't hear from folks. And as 2020 has already been verified, there's no verification needed if 2020 and 2021 are selected. That's correct. No additional verification needed there. Finally, the only scenario that avoids an extra verification is selection of the 2020 and 2021 as the 2 years. Correct. That's true, although we have a number of folks who've already included and verified 2019. So for them, I guess they have a little bit of extra optionality still without any additional verification at this point. So interesting question here. Typically, drilling and completion fuel volumes that had carbon tax paid are not included in compliance determination. This should also be taking into consideration for benchmarking purposes. So generally, the intention is that people have access to the exemption from the federal fuel charge for their drilling and completion volumes. So I'm assuming that in most cases, people had included those in their 2020 tier reporting and gotten the benefit of the exemption from them. I guess where people have significant volumes that they paid the federal fuel charge on for 2020 and weren't included in your 2020 reporting, I'd maybe ask you to get in touch with the department because that could disadvantage you in terms of the benchmark setting. Question from Jerry. If an aggregate is transferred from one company to another, would the transfer year serve as the year entering the regulation for the transferee? I think generally where we have the historic data for the facilities within the aggregate, and those facilities have been in the tier system, we definitely have some options to use those historic years, especially if an entire aggregate is being transferred. So if somebody is taking over an aggregate, I think we're open to have a conversation about the benchmark period with that company that's taking over the aggregate, and where we have the data to support it. I think we're also happy to include the years that had previously been used for benchmarking that aggregate under the prior owner. Question from Jeff. If you used a 2019 benchmark for 2020 compliance and your facility list has changed from what you used in the 2019 benchmark and the facility is removed, will the 2019 benchmark be able to be restated to reflect the change for 21 compliance to ensure a comparative facility list? So yes. I mean, I guess please let us know by September 1st of that situation, but what you're describing, I think we should have the data on hand to make those adjustments to the to the aggregate in the case you're describing, where you've got removal of facilities from your aggregate. Question here, I'm not totally sure I understand from Nelson. If an operator does select a new benchmark by September 1st, 2021, will the verification be due June 30th, 2022? Is there any advantage to submit earlier, like in 2021? So if, I guess really the situation currently would be if somebody elects to include 2019 in their benchmark period and hadn't previously verified it. That's probably the most common case where additional verification would be needed. And I think what we're saying is that we'd expect that to be into us by the end of calendar year if somebody wants to take that pathway. Will the benchmark methodology remain the same, specifically with respect to the denominator unit? I think we talked about this a little bit before, but I think the hope is that we've gotten most people on a robust production unit at this point. If aggregates are seeing otherwise, we're open to conversation about the denominator unit. But by and large, I think we're hoping to keep the units that people have been assigned for their 2020 reporting. A question here, was any consideration given to drilling completion activities that were carried out in locations wells that are not associated with a Petronex ID included in the aggregate? So I guess if you've got fuel use at locations not included in your aggregate, that fuel use would be subject to the federal fuel charge. So it's really, when we're looking at either benchmarking or compliance reporting, it's really about those conventional oil and gas facilities that are included as part of your aggregate. I don't know if that answers the question, but we'll be giving an email address for follow-up questions if there are others coming out of this session.
I think also, John, what this question may refer to the case when there is no Petronex ID established yet for the facility when there is drilling completion going on, in which case we would be open to accept surface location and any other kind of identification data for the facility to allow them to go into aggregate.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Reagan. Thank you. Will the benchmark for 2023 be the 2022 benchmark less 10% and every year forward? So currently the reduction target for the aggregate facilities is 10%, and there isn't a tightening component to that in the aggregate approach. Is it required to consider additional 2020 data for the facilities that were missed to be added into the 2020 aggregate facility, but added into the 2021 aggregate list? Is verification required for this case? So, like in general, and we haven't spelled this out in detail yet, but I think we are looking to create some thresholds where we would make adjustments to benchmarks because of the updates to the population that are in an aggregate. I guess where possible, we'd look to use historic data for that purpose. So it could be the case if there is a significant change to your aggregate and we don't have the historic data to support that we may need additional data from you to make those benchmark adjustments. Question from Brent, for an aggregate, all facilities would need to have the same benchmarking year, right? So generally speaking, yes. So like we'd be using the same period for the aggregate. I guess it is possible if you have some sites within your aggregate that started operating during that period, that they may not be fully covered by all the years in that benchmarking period. This question from Mosey, I think, kind of relates to a previous question we had. So for benchmarking, are facilities still required to exclude emissions from fuels for which carbon price was paid in 2020? This results in an artificially low facility-specific benchmark for some facilities, meaning that they may have a higher reduction obligation in the future. So I think in those kinds of situations where there's been significant fuels not reported for 2020 because the federal fuel charges paid on those, I think we would like to hear from those aggregates to understand the situation better, to make sure that we don't disadvantage from the perspective of benchmarking. Yeah, so good question from Nazar. So my understanding is that 2019 has fuel volumes reported to Petronex under the old fuel flare event definitions. Does AEP expect these volumes to be adjusted to align with the tier definitions of stationary fuel combustion emissions? So we have not required that for the 2019 benchmarking that's already been done, and I don't think we're going to make any change there. My understanding is that that some aggregates are still making alignments with the new vent flare requirements, and we may, I guess, revisit that topic when we get to review the tier regulation generally. But no, if you're submitting 2019 data, it can be aligned with the Petronex reporting that you have for 2019. Okay, so a question here from Blake. If a company was not previously registered in tier, wishes to join for 2021, do they need to meet the September deadline as well? So I would say generally yes. Like if you haven't yet registered for tier as an aggregate and you'd like to for 2021, please do so as soon as possible. We're providing a little bit of extra flexibility for people to identify that they want to be in tier for 2021. Normally, the election to come in to tier as an aggregate needs to be done by the December 1st of the year prior. But if you're planning to come into tier and you haven't done so yet, I suggest to do so as soon as possible. And yes, please let us know by September 1st about your benchmarking approach. Oh, this is an interesting question. So Barry's asking, will the benchmark by facility using Petronex IDs be public so that we may include the benchmark in our acquisitions? We haven't given that any thought. It's an interesting idea. We do have a challenge there probably in terms of the non-Petronex fuels that we have reported to us that aren't allocated down to the Petronex ID level. But thanks for the question, Barry. We'll certainly give that a little bit more thought. Okay, we also have a good question here from Logan. During large acquisitions divestitures, how are different reporting methods combined into a single aggregate? If one company used one production metric as a denominator and the other used a different one, or if we use 2019 and one use 2020, does this automatically trigger a rebenchmark? So it certainly could create challenges. I guess the other layer of complexity there could be if people used different quantification methods within the two companies. It may be the situation, as I've said, maybe in other situations where the department needs additional data that we don't have on hand to support a benchmarking process where there are acquisitions and divestitures. So Paul's asked, I believe you mentioned the company may make a selection of which of the 4 options it wants for 2021 compliance for a year by September 1st, 2021. Is that decision then set in stone going forward, or can it be revisited again in 2022? And so the answer is it could be revisited again in 2022. There is an ongoing ability for aggregates to make application to have their benchmark reviewed or updated, and so that request can be made on an annual basis. Oh, that's an interesting question too from Jeff. If we use 2019 as a benchmark for 2020 compliance, are we able to drop 2019 and just use 2020 for 2021 compliance and go forward? So I think that's allowed for in the approach that we've outlined here. And similar question, duplicate of that, I think. Got a few more questions here we'll try to get through, and then we can move on to the rest of the slides. To confirm, may have missed this, to include 2021 data in the baseline development for the 2021 compliance reporting year. Yeah, so you cannot, the intention is that you cannot use 2021 as part of your benchmark for the 2021 reporting period. So you would, I think Dragon's got the slide up there. So if you wanted to use 2021, it would get added to the 2020 data for the 2022 reporting. And again, there wouldn't be any verification required in that case. We just ask you to make that indication to us by September 1st that that was the approach that you were wanting to take. All right. Paul's asked, are there any other deadlines besides the September 1st deadline that we need to be aware of? I guess, like as we've mentioned, if you would be electing to put to add 2019 to your benchmarking period, we would like to have that data to us, to the department, before the end of calendar year. Okay, and Clem's asked for some clarification around the exemption of the federal or fuels where the federal fuel charge has been paid. And so just to reiterate how that works. So where a facility has elected to pay the federal fuel charge at a period in time when they have access to the exemption certificate, those emissions from those fuels don't have to be reported under tier, but the 2 criteria are required. So you have to have paid the federal fuel charge, and it has to be a fuel that was obtained during a time period where you had the federal fuel charge exemption in place. Okay, and so I think this question from Jared is kind of a follow-up to the clarification that Dragon had provided. So drilling and completion operations generally occur before there's an Alberta battery code available, before the location can be included within a tier aggregate. Should we use lat longs for future locations to add them to our existing aggregates that are not currently part of an aggregate, since when operations are occurring, they're not technically included in tier yet? So yes, if you would like to include sites that don't yet have a Petronex facility ID, you can do so in order to have those sites be part of your aggregate during the drilling and completion activity. But please do include the latitude, longitude data, as well as creating a meaningful name, and we would look to to get the Petronex ID from you when it's available. Okay, question from Peter. Following for the drilling locations, if a drilling location is changed from one location to another, when is the last date that this new location can be added to an existing aggregate? So existing sites can be added to an existing aggregate, I believe, up until December 1st of the current year. But again, depending when that site was operational, our advice would be to add it to your aggregate, I guess, as soon as possible. Okay, well, Dragan, maybe we better move on to some of the subsequent slides before we get any more really good questions.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, thanks, John, very much, and thanks everyone for great questions. Really good questions. So let me just go where we was. Okay, so I guess at this point we would just like to remind everyone about next steps, and basically we have distributed our discussion guide and the feedback form and posted on the website, and we would really appreciate if you could also provide us with the written feedback if you had no chance either to address your questions or simply provide us with additional feedback in regards to these two topics. We will be communicating again these two approaches, both for the reference years and drilling completion. These are our preferred approaches so far, based on what we learned to date, hearing from stakeholders like yourself. But the final decision on that will be communicated, and it's going to go to the same, basically, a stakeholder list, which is comprised of those who are subscribers to our conventional oil and gas website, and those who are either reporters or certifying officials for the aggregates. On that point, if you are not subscriber to our website, please do so. And I guess as the final step would be updating the standard for developing benchmarks based on the final decision that has been made. Again, thanks very much for the great questions we received so far, and I would like to ask John to kind of provide with some closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dragan. Well, we'd certainly like to thank everybody for their participation today. Some really great questions to help us flesh out the guidance around this topic. So really do appreciate your participation and your interest today. We'll again try to publish and communicate the final path forward on this as soon as we can, because we understand that people need to build this into their planning. We've tried to create some pathways that let people carry on from what they've already done for 2020. So hopefully there's not unnecessary or undesirable disruption to folks that have charted a path already for 2020 purposes. And maybe I'll just answer one last question here. Will there be able to have written answers to the questions that were answered verbally in this session? We'll look at that. I know that there may be some transcripting capabilities that we might be able to take advantage of there, but there was a lot of there were a lot of good questions, so we'll take that away and look at the potential of posting the summary of the Q&A that we had today. Okay, I don't think there's anything else. Thanks to everybody on our side too for the work for the seminar today, and thanks again to all the participants. We'll be in touch soon. Take care.
Okay, thank you.